So I was excluded from school in 1995. So I was around 14, 15. Like I said, we wrapped up at Stoke-on-Trent when I was 13 years old, and I'd had 18 different places to live, and my mum found a partner. Now, this one partner was probably, to be honest, my saving grace for my development, because he had 3 girls, he didn't have a boy, he rejected my brother because my brother's behaviour was challenging to him. And when that happened, I realised how powerful this person is within the house. So my brother went back into residential care, and he was the only one, and the rest of us were at home. And so he got me in school, and a bit like mum with the false compliance, disguised compliance, I went to school for a period of time for probably about 18 months and had a stable education. And back then, schools weren't really communicating with each other. So the school in Stoke-on-Trent didn't really understand that I was so far behind because I'd not really had any primary education. And that was a bit problematic for me in school. So the way I used to hide that, so hiding to some degree, was to be problematic in class so that I was sent out. Because I didn't want to be exposed, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And once I was excluded from school, then you are left in a position where, particularly at the time during the day when children are at school, you don't want to sit in the house. So then you try to work out who is it that I'm going to spend time with. And that's when my vulnerabilities were probably exposed a little bit. And I came across a drug dealer because I was smoking weed. I mean, I'd been smoking drugs. I started smoking at 11 and I'd started taking cannabis by 12. So this is when I was 15 years old, and I'd started spending time with people that were taking heroin. So by 15 years old, before I'd officially left school and my peers were taking their exams, I'd started taking heroin. And we used to buy sometimes heroin, sometimes cannabis. And the cannabis dealer was also quietly, because it was quite taboo to take heroin, he was taking heroin. And he came across me and my friend, right? So he said to us, "Have you guys tried heroin?" And so we said, "Yeah." So he said, "Well, if I buy you 2 a bag of heroin, will you get a bag of heroin from me?" Because he didn't want to be seen by his peers or associates to be buying heroin. And of course, that to us just seemed like a win-win situation. But he then found that I was quite resilient, naturally probably bright, to be fair, which has probably saved me in the end, but also incredibly streetwise. And so very quickly he realised that he was spending money on heroin. I mean, this guy was a drug dealer, right? So very quickly he worked out, I don't want to spend money on drugs. Or what I'll do is I'll give you X amount of heroin, and I will just smoke the profits, etc. And I was pretty good at it, to be honest. And my mum just turned a blind eye, because by this point, mum couldn't really control me. The guy that got me back in school realised that our family was quite dysfunctional. So as much as he was a really good role model, he kind of felt that this is a bit too much and took off. And then the whole house fell apart again. So I was addicted to heroin. My brother was addicted to heroin. He was only 14 at the time, still living in a residential home. And very quickly, somebody else noticed that I was able to shift thousands of pounds worth of heroin. And before you know it, he's giving me even more heroin, and up the chain I went. And so this family that's got no income or finance has got an XR3. I mean, I couldn't even drive anyway, so I was only 15, but they gave me a car that I could get other people to drive. And in the book, we talk about child criminal exploitation and stuff at the moment, but where was the community? Like, there's a bright orange car outside my house, and a mobile phone in 1997, 1998. So nobody had mobile phones. I can remember going outside school with this big MR1. I don't know if you can remember it, but it was a massive,
great big boxes.
Yeah, massive. But so I was outside school, like showing all the kids. I'd probably have nobody on the phone, and so I was just really young and naive, and I got really involved in really high end drug dealers, and interestingly enough, that the police, it was almost like we were caught in a web, because the police were actually implicit. So the first guy that was selling cannabis for me, he was a police informant, and so I got no evidence about this, but he was obviously giving the police information. And I eventually, in November of 1998, was caught twice with almost the mirror image of cannabis, of heroin, which the court said that was worth £5,000. But I was caught in his car, which was at the time and was it an XR3i? It was a very, very fancy drug car at that time. In fact, they pulled us over because it was a known drug vehicle. But the following day, he persuaded me to go back to the police station and said that I found them drugs belonged to me, and that I was distributing them to friends. And the police accepted them charges. And, you know, my brother was also in the back of the car. They dropped the charges against my brother, dropped the charges against the adult. And because I was quite naive, and the guy had kids, and I didn't really want kids to grow up without their father around. And eventually, later on that month, I was caught again with the same amount of heroin, and then eventually I was given an 18-month prison sentence. I went to HMP Brinsford, and he was never charged or. So I always say, whenever I talk about this, it's not that I don't believe. I mean, I was, by that time, I'd just turned 17 years old, so I don't believe for one moment that I'm saying that I shouldn't have been accountable. But the idea that he wasn't sat in that dock next to me when I was in his car, and when they kind of busted out the house, or whatever, if you like, there was nothing in the house of any value whatsoever other than this massive amount of drugs. So it wouldn't have taken a genius. We don't really have to be saying it's child criminal exploitation to work out something wasn't quite right with that situation.
There's probably more behind the scenes you don't understand, though.
Oh, well, there was, because when I was eventually caught, so they would put me in a bail hostel in Ensmere Port, that's near Liverpool, so I had to travel on my own as a 17-year-old heroin addict from Stoke-on-Trent up to Ensmere Port. And so eventually, of course, with a heroin addiction, I couldn't stay there. So I ran off, and eventually I got caught in January of 1999, and the police pretty much told, well, in fact, in the police car, I told them that I knew this guy was a police informant, right? So while I was in prison, 4 weeks in, this guy comes to visit me in prison and tells me to just keep my mouth shut, you know, stop telling people that he's a police informant. Like, how did he know that? So again, that's what I mean about being caught in a web.
Yeah.
Because I was quite young and naive, and it seemed that it was coming in from lots of different directions.
And easy pickings, I suppose, from your perspective as a 17-year-old. You know, it paid some of the bills. I suppose it made sure your mum could keep the house going. And were you kind of responsible for paying bills?
From my point of view, no, not for paying bills. So from my point of view, I was just substituting my heroin addiction. So in fact, at some point, so basically I would get the amount of the profit, which usually, I don't know, 30 quid for a couple of days. I would use that, and then I would be breaking into the heroin that I would be selling to the drug dealers, which if I got caught doing that, you know, I would have been in serious trouble.
Yeah.
But I felt at that point, I mean, heroin addiction is a very, very powerful thing, as I'm sure you're aware. And so I was just willing to take that risk. So I was making absolutely no money whatsoever. My mum, when Chris came to the house, he would sometimes, he would give mum £10, you know, get the kids some fish and chips, this kind of stuff. So not necessarily paying bills, but he was quite clever at being able to get my mum not to look in our direction, if that makes sense.
So what was happening with the rest of your family, Andy, at that point? What was happening with all the other kids?
The police were aware that this 17-year-old boy in a single family house with smaller siblings was involved in heroin addiction. That's the second time they caught me. They caught the drugs in the house. And the first time they caught me, they found more drugs in the house after finding me in the car. So it's like, well, you know, my sisters were a lot younger than me. So they would have been 11 and 7 at the time. So, but there was no referral to social care. There was no referral to any external services at that point. And eventually when I was arrested and remanded and went to Brinsford, my brother was actually remanded for burglaries while he was living in a residential home, went to the same prison, and my mum just moved back to Leeds. My mum was really good at thinking the problems lied in the area. So if she just moved, she would solve the problems. But of course, we know that the problems lied a little bit deeper than that. But again, when we talk about trauma, you know, when I was growing up with a family like mine, the best way I could describe it is the trauma's never ending, because you're induced with all the and interconnected with all these relationships, and all my siblings were traumatized as children, and my mum was traumatized. So inside that house, it was like it was a cauldron for trauma, and so and our behaviour was continuously influencing each other and causing us to, as a family, to experience traumatic events. So and my brother.
Ideally, Andy, if you look at it now as an adult, looking back on how you were growing up, would it have been better to have been removed, subject to a care order, and placed with a foster family, or do you not know?
You know, the last person that asked me that question was a child when I was in, and I think thinking to myself, you know, they go straight in at the deep end. But it's a really, really good question. And when I was returned home after, I think it was 2 years of being in care, I was living with a foster carer, and that was the safest I ever felt as a child. And but I can remember social workers asking me what I wanted, and this is the thing about human connection and attachment. What do you think I said to the social workers when they asked me if I wanted to go home?
Well, you wanted to.
Of course I wanted to, even though that home was extremely unsafe, even though I knew that we really never got anything nice. I mean, I can remember being in that, I'm not saying it's about material things, but I can remember being in that foster home, and the woman was really caring, you know, she was really nurturing, and the food was just, you'd open up the fridge and there was food in there. Like, it was just, you know, for me, that was just unknown, particularly the fridge. I mean, our freezer was, my mum did the best. She put through, everything was frozen. So she fish, burgers, whatever, and the freezer would be full. She had 5 kids to feed, and she never really bought any fresh food. So the only thing that was in the fridge was often milk and margarine. To go to this woman's house and see the fridge full, I can always remember thinking that was almost like a privilege. And so deep down, I probably wanted to stay with Ivy, but I just could not bring myself to say that I didn't want to be with my family.
I'm looking at it from the perspective of representing children for a long, long time in care proceedings. Majority of them were babies, because most care order applications, as I expect you know, are on very young children. But whenever you do work in a case where there are older children, sometimes I think, well, you answer me this. What would have happened? You were asked whether you wanted to go home and be with your mum or not. Is that right, do you think, to be asked that? Or do you think adults who are involved in these processes should take some responsibility for what might be right for you, because you're not able to perhaps judge that as well as an adult might? What do you think? What would you think about that now? If somebody said to you, hear what you say, but we're here to try and do the best for you, and you seem happy where you are, we think you should stay there, and that's what we're going to tell a judge. What would you have felt like?
I think this is what you're drawing out here. I think is one of the setbacks with the care system, and it's under review at the moment. And I think you can review it as much as you want, to be honest. But these questions are philosophical. How do you ever get that right? I would imagine at that time I would have felt completely unheard and lost, and baffled by why I wasn't allowed to spend time with my family, because it was essential to my identity that I spent time with my family, because I've reached 7 years old.
I'm not meaning that people would say you shouldn't see the family, or you shouldn't, you know. Have
no, I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah.
But the point is, for me, actually looking back, knowing what happened after we were returned home, if there isn't a real robust plan around keeping that family together, because basically after they returned us home, I've got the paperwork. There's no even exit strategy. Do you know? No. Like I'm a professional now, so there were no exit plan.
Absolutely.
There was no drawing. You know, my mum did have siblings, they had their own problems going on as well, but like a family group conference to bring everybody together and say, how do we make sure that you come back and that you're held accountable? Because my mum continued to move after that. So there was no accountability. So they closed the case. And, one thing I didn't mention is that when we eventually were removed, it wasn't because of dysfunctionality, it was because of direct sexual abuse to my siblings. So my mum couldn't keep us safe. So I don't know how only a small amount of time, or it'd be 2 years, you close a case and let that single woman then raise 5 children.
Neither do I. Neither do I.
No accountability.
No, so I agree.
So I suppose the way I'm trying to answer that question is almost like twofold. So I've answered it as where I probably would have thought about it as a 7-year-old child. And this is why I think it's a problem within the care system, because you're going to make that child feel lost, and that may well go on through adulthood. But with my professional insight now, there shouldn't have been a transition home and a case closed at such an early stage, because the evidence, as far as I can see and I know, is that mum couldn't raise 5 children on her own. It was that simple. So they needed to provide, if they were going to take us home, they needed to make sure that there was an intervention that was continuous, supportive, relational, and accountability was there for mum to not move the way she moved. And it was in the files at 9 years old. It says that when mum again, we were getting threats. We were living in a really deprived area of Leeds. So when we were transitioned back again, I'm not saying that families should be moved to affluent areas, but it was like the most deprived, crime-ridden area in Leeds. And so we as a family, being pretty dysfunctional, attracted attention. And eventually people were coming to the house with knives, or at one point they took our stereo out the house, walked in our house and took our stereo, and we were all really scared. So mum then said, I want to move. And in black and white in the paperwork, it says to mum, Andrew has missed out on too much education. You simply cannot move again. And after that, there was just move after move. It just didn't stop. So when I was released, and when my mum moved back to Leeds, my brother was released first, I was released second. And then just to give you a snap picture, I'd spent that 7 months getting clean. So I was strong back, I was healthy, heroin completely. Imagine being addicted to heroin at 16 years old. My body was so weak. And I was vomiting time. It took me about 2 months to recover. And eventually I got my strength back, got my health back, got my focus back, got my mental health back. And bought into this probably illusion that I know lots of people in prison do, is that you're trapped like a bird. So all they walk around doing is talking about when you're getting out. There's a couple of questions. Why are you in? When you're getting out? That's it. So I've got my day focused in my head and thought that I'm going to get out. Life's going to be great. I'm going to really work on, making sure that I don't come back into this situation again. The problem with sometimes when we talk about rehabilitation or reintegration is in the definition for rehabilitation, it says restoring someone or something back to a previous state of health in the dictionary. So the problem I've got with the word and how it's applied in criminal justice sense is that I'd never been in a position that the criminal justice system was trying to get me back to. So I'm not sure I know what the word is right. No. I'm not quite sure that's the right word. So when I was released on the day, I was released from Onley prison, and my mum came and picked me up with a new boyfriend that she met. To be fair to the lad, he had a car. That was an upgrade for my mum. And they come and picked me up from Onley and drove me back to Leeds. And when I walked back into this new estate, where I'd never lived, a place called Rothwell in Leeds, almost all the estate was in the house. So they were all drinking and smoking. How are you doing, Andy? Welcome out, because that's what always happened in our house. Everybody, because all 5 siblings we had alcohol problems, drug problems, or we were involved in crime. So therefore we spent time with people that were doing them things. Mum couldn't control the house, so then people came into the house. And I can remember going upstairs in the bedroom after seeing all these people. And I'll be honest, I felt like I felt like, and obviously I've done what I've done now in terms of writing a book and finding youth justice. I always felt I deserved more than that. And so, which might sound really egotistical, I'm not sure, but I remember going upstairs into the bedroom and sitting on the bedroom. I just wanted to scream, because all the 7 months that I've spent refocusing my mind on what I aspired to have, that experience was just heartbreaking, because it just meant that I realised at that moment in time, this is going to be tough, and inevitably it was. And so I returned to heroin addiction. Not straight away. I got moved out, got myself a house, but got into conflict with a neighbour, and then went back to prison and went on a revolving door of heroin addiction and prison until I was 23. And that was the last time I was released. So I spent almost 4 years in custody for a number of dysfunctional crimes. And interestingly, when I wrote the book, Your Honour, every single time I've been to prison has been for a substance-related offence. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm minimising or I'm justifying my own behaviour, but when we look at the adverse childhood experiences research, what we know is that those that have experienced significant childhood trauma, there's a significant, it increases the likelihood. So it doesn't mean it's definite by any stretch, but it increases the likelihood of substance misuse. And so all of my criminality was really mostly around being violent when I was drunk, or committing acquisitive offences whilst I was on heroin. And so when I was 23 and released from HMP Lingdome, it kind of dawned on me that I suppose I'm old enough and mature enough now to start thinking about how I'm using substances, stopped using substances, stopped offending. I think when we're talking about background, sometimes I believe that things happen before you're even born, and that can have influences on your life circumstances. And the reason why I say that is because obviously before I came, my grandmother ended up in a mental health institution, and she had 5 children, and that was as a result of serious domestic violence. And social care were involved, and all 5 of my mum and her siblings were removed and placed in care as a result.
When roughly would that have been, Andy? What kind of year would that be?
Well, that would have been, I think my mum was 13, so you putting me on the spot. If I was born in 81, that would have been around 76, 77.
So we're talking about way before the Children Act came in then?
We're talking about way before the Children Act of 1989. Yeah. And there was some, they were all separated. So some went into, described, I guess, as kinship with family friends. My mum was moved originally to Kent on her own, so she felt quite isolated because her siblings were in Leeds. That resulted in her coming back to Leeds, and because she couldn't go in one of these kinship placements, she was placed in a residential home somewhere in Leeds. And she's told me that she didn't like it there and she was frequently running off. So this was by the time she was 16. And the reason why I think that's relevant for me is because she fell pregnant with me when she was 16 years old whilst in the residential home with a 16-year-old boy, whom obviously is my father, but I've never seen him. So, but I can understand from the reason why that happened was because his mum intervened at that point and probably felt, you know, this family or this circumstance is not going to be good for you. So don't take any responsibility for this, you know, just come back home and we'll take care of you. And so I know there was a bit of a punch up, I think, between the families at that point. So mum obviously wanted to go through the pregnancy. She was quite isolated and alone, and had me, probably thought she was going to get that unconditional love, which of course she would have got with having a new child, but she just didn't have the skills. She'd not got through school, she didn't get placement, she'd experienced sexual abuse herself, and she obviously didn't have the support network around her to give me as a child what I needed. And then went on to have another 5 children by the time she was 24. I was 34, I've got a 5-year-old daughter, so I was 34 when I had Isabel. And it's one of the most difficult things I've ever had to do, parenting a child. So to think that she was 24 with 5 children to 4 different men at that point. And I think the other thing to add as well is that mum, because of her unmet needs, because of the way she was treated by various men, she was sexually abused twice, mum, before I was born, she sought out the wrong type of relationships in men, whatever that is. But she brought a lot of, every man that I remember bar a few, and there were lots of different men that came at lots of different times. They were all involved. They'd either experienced care themselves, many of them, or they had traumatic and difficult childhoods, and they had substance misuse problems. They were involved in crime, etc., etc. So that had a significant role in my behaviour at a very young age. So we talk a lot about intergenerational trauma and how things transfer from one generation to the other, whether it be familial or otherwise. And I think for me, since I've done a lot of research in later on, I find it interesting that actually what we know is that stress can be passed from the mother to the unborn child through the placenta. So stress releases hormones in the body, such as cortisol and adrenaline, and lots of research indicates that if a woman is overly stressed, not stressed out for minor things, but continuously stressed as a result of domestic violence or instability, poverty, etc., cortisol can pass through the placenta to the unborn child, and it can gather in the amniotic fluid. And so there's research that shows that can have developmental problems for the child when it's born. So that's part of the biological transfer from the parent to the child of trauma, if you like. But then what I described there in terms of the people that were around me as I was growing is the environmental transfer of traumatic events. So my mum's experience of domestic violence, the care experience, not feeling supported and running away, etc., meant that she created the environment for me as I was a developing child, and that had significant problems for me as I was growing up and going through my childhood and adolescence.
So do you think was accommodation a problem, and were you very poor as far as, monetarily poor, I mean? Were all those things happening?
Well, some of my childhood memories, my mum did the best she could given the circumstances that she was provided, and so she made some really poor choices. But mum was under a lot of pressure, and we continually moved. So by the time I reached 13 years old, I've wrote 2 books, and the first book that I wrote was about some of this stuff, my lived experiences of some of this and recovering. And some of my early memories, in fact, I did an activity before I wrote that book, and I looked at how many properties that I could remember that we'd lived in. So when as I said, my mum was 16, she fell pregnant with me. She then fell pregnant with my next brother, and so she was 18. And for some reason that she can't really articulate to me even now, she decided to go to London. Within a week of being in London, she met somebody from Scotland. That person decided give her the opportunity to move to Scotland with her. Mum took that and had my sister in Scotland, again to a dad that she's never met, and then come back to Leeds. And so they're addresses that I've gathered from speaking to Mum. But then all the addresses that I know I lived in, that I can remember I lived in Leeds and Stoke-on-Trent, because they're 2 places I grew up. When I did the activity, the ones that I know of were 18 different places to live by the time I'd reached 13 years old. And part of the reason for that is because Mum was removed as a child, and then as a result of some of the things that were going on, we eventually, after Scotland, and when my baby sister was on her way, so my mum was 24, we landed in a place called Hyde Park in Leeds, and that was probably the one place we were stable. So by this time I was 7 years old, and so I got in school. So you can imagine what my school, or lack of, looks like until 7 years old. So when I was 7, I went to Ranform School. And also, to write my first book, I also accessed my care files. And that's when the involvement of Children's Social Work Service from my siblings' generation, if you like, started. Because my brother, who was 5, was lighting fires in the house. And my mum, feeling responsible for trying to get him to stop lighting fires, because obviously there were the children in the house, we were in the house. She probably tried, and in probably a lack of capacity, decided that the best way to do that would be to show him that fire burns, and she burned his hand. And he told teachers at school that had happened. Social care got involved. I was 7 years old. And then looking through the care files, there was just a significant amount of traumatic events that happened in the house during that period. So
what about before then, Andy? Sorry to interrupt you, but before then, were social services involved before that episode with your brother?
No. And I think, well, there wouldn't have been, because my mum was just skipping from one place to the next. And that's, so sorry, I probably missed a bit out there. So at the beginning, mum was so fearful. So when you asked about poverty, like I can remember some of my childhood memories, most of them were, they were being at the benefits office.
Yeah.
What one would, what you know, do you remember the old ashtrays that used to come up?
Yeah.
So I can remember them being everywhere in these fixed chairs in the benefits office, and I'm probably exposing my mum a little bit here, but she would often say that a bag had been stolen because, you know, and you'd need a crime number to then put in for a crisis loan, and that is the way mum lived her life. But she was also fearful of services getting involved, because I think she was well aware that she wasn't coping and she couldn't cope. So I think that's what probably played a role in the move after move after move. And then when I could start remembering the moves, it was a lot because we would get, I don't know, a washing machine or a fridge from loan men, and then she wouldn't have the money to pay them back. And so because there were rental properties, she would literally just up and leave, with probably not a lot of consideration about the implication for our schooling. And, you know, so in terms of poverty, in my second book, Connecting with Young People in Trouble, I think most people understand economic poverty quite well. So people have money, wealth, and people don't have money and lack wealth. What I think we don't fully understand is relational poverty. And going up solely with my mum being my sole carer and these other inappropriate, probably perplexed men coming in and out of the house, what that meant for me as a developing child, they were my relational
your relations
attachment.
Yeah.
So they were my attachments, right? So I think if we look at poverty or the kind of wealth structure through the lens of relationships, what we know is that children in the first 1,000 days of their lives, they need nurturing, caring relationships with care providers. They don't always have to be parents. That's why if you might have somebody who's experiencing economic poverty, but they stay in the same place, they might go to a school and have a teacher, a youth worker, a relative, or somebody else that can be that nurturing, caring adult that can help that child develop neurologically the way that any child needs. And I think sometimes we think that's resilience. I struggle with the word resilience sometimes, because I think children don't develop that on their own. We've all got an innate. So Dr. Dan Siegel I looked at a lot of his work for my second book, and he's an expert in interpersonal neurobiology, and he talks about the fact that everybody's got an innate potential for attachments, but they need development they need experiences to develop. And the best way I would describe my childhood is that I was challenged economically, but also relationally, and that had profound consequences for me during my early years and adolescence.
Yes, well, it makes a big difference to your experience of adverse events, doesn't it? Because if you have somebody who helps you to cope with it and understand it, you can cope with an adverse event much more effectively than if you're just finding your way as a child without an idea about how you should deal with it. Correct.
And when we think about this groundbreaking research in 1997, 1998 from Vincent Folletti in America, when they found the adverse childhood experiences research, and they had 17,000 participants, which was the biggest piece of research ever done around childhood abuse. And basically, they asked 10 questions. So it was an epidemiological study. So it wasn't looking at qualitative research, if you want. It was quantitative. So they asked 17,000 participants 10 questions around childhood abuse, household dysfunction, substance misuse, etc. And what they found was that there's a dose-response relationship between the higher amount of adversity that you experience and medical outcomes. So the 3 leading causes of death in America. But they also found that there was a significant link with social outcomes. So the higher dosage of ACEs, the higher you're likely to have substance misuse. The higher doses of ACEs, the higher you were likely to experience prison, suicide, etc. And a lot of the critics, of course, were saying that, of course, if you grow up in poverty, you're more likely to make poor life choices. That's obvious. But the science behind the research was exactly what I said about the intergenerational transfer of stress. So if a child is stressed out continuously, chronically through developmental years, then it excessively releases cortisol in the body. And what the science behind the research shows is that that's profoundly negative. It's like groundbreaking, but it has profound consequences for children.
And it sounds from what you've said, Andy, that your mum didn't have any really good experiences. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but when she grew up, you said she was in care. Is that right?
Yeah, so she was. Yeah, so she came into care quite late, actually, which was obviously a very difficult thing to do during adolescence. And it was the residential home that she really struggled to live in, and I think she struggled because the other siblings were with people that they really got along with, and that wasn't possible for her.
Right.
And
so
I think
she didn't know how to parent. I mean, she hadn't been parented very well, it sounds like. So how could she parent you? How would she know what was right for you and your siblings?
Well, she didn't. And this is the stuff around this kind of cycle of abuse or intergenerational trauma. So the implications for this cycle, if you like, from my family were that I was removed and placed in care when I was 7, albeit to be fair to my mum, when she was put in a mother and baby unit, when the 3 older ones, me, my brother and sister, had to go into care because the only people that could go in this mother and baby unit were. So that was the reason we were removed. And initially, looking through my care files, and this is fair play to mum, is that it basically said that in the first 6 months, there was questions about my mum's capacity to look after 2. So how on earth was she going to look after 5? But they put her in and this is in black and white in February, which is really great to read sometimes, is that they took her in a room and they said, this is our observation. And my mum said, you're not going to take my children. It's written down like that, and stomped out the room. And then they've seen a significant turnaround in her behaviour. And I think from my years of experience in services, or youth justice service and social care, and my personal experience of looking back at what happened there, is that they frightened her to a point of where she, we'll call it disguised compliance, if you like. She wanted to present an image so that she could fight to get the 3 older children back, but I don't think it was sustainable. What she was presenting wasn't sustainable, and being with her after that experience and social care closing the case, that's backed up by what I experienced after.
How many people do you think are successful like you, though, Andy? I think you're very unusual because, I can't imagine that people manage it so well as you have. Most people get into that cycle and they never get out of it.
I think really it was wrapped in a lack of self-confidence. And I never knew I lacked self-confidence. I thought I was really confident. I thought I was. The best way to describe it really would be in terms of relationships with women, right? So until I met my wife, I never really had a real relationship with a woman or a girl. And all these years, I convinced myself that it was because, I just didn't want a relationship, and, girls are, annoying and, whatever. And obviously I've got needs, but I don't really want a partner. But I was just kidding myself. The reason I wasn't having a relationship is because I didn't want anybody to see me. I didn't want anybody to actually see who I was and what I was about, because I didn't think there was anything worth getting close to know. And I think, so psychologically, I've done some really interesting things. And I think once I'd established who I was in life and what I stood for and my values and my principles, hey presto, I'm able to meet a lovely woman and persuade her to marry me and try to be the best man I can be for her and the best father to my daughter. To be honest, I think when I talk about kind of, healing, if you want, from the experiences that I've had. And we know that, for example, within the criminal justice system, it's around 46% of people that leave custody reoffend within a 12-month period. So when we talk about, where I would give myself a pat on the back to some degree is that when we think about things on an intersectional nature, so the coming together of vulnerabilities, the coming together of adversities, the lack of relationships, if we think about my backstory, look at when I was born. I was born into not a predisposition to offend, but a predisposition to certainly have a challenging childhood. And then I was moved around, so I wasn't able to build attachments probably to adults or carers that were able to help me develop the way I needed to develop at that stage. And then I was removed from mum and family, and then I was excluded from school, and then I was exploited to some degree into offending and got a heroin addiction, and then spent 4 years in and out of prison, and somehow managed to persuade Leeds Youth Justice Service to give me an opportunity off the back of that. So the foreword in Can I Tell You My Story was done by Jim Hopkins, who was running the service at that point, and he talks about the fact that he was kind of presented with this, do we give this guy a contract? Looked at my DBS check and probably thought, this is crazy. But I'm a relational, so my brother, so going back to the kind of care experience and the trauma, the intergenerational trauma, again, my mum was in care, me and my brother next to me, he was in care. His children have been removed and been adopted. And so that just gives you a level of insight into the family that I've grown up in. Yeah. And my brother hasn't had the outcomes that I've had.
Now, your brother's story is the one we're most familiar with.
Yeah.
The one in which people don't escape from these cycles. Because it's difficult. It's difficult.
And I think I could sit here and I could say, right, do you know what? I'm just really resilient, and I'm really strong, and I've got a work ethic, and I made better choices. And that would be probably in part true. But I think that I've had this innate natural ability to build relationships with people outside of our immediate network. And from my experience with my brother, for example, he doesn't have that. He hasn't been able to maintain some level of functionality. And so the relationships that he would need to help him come out of the situation that he's in, he's unable to access them. Now, you could say that's about personal choice. I just believe that's sometimes about character and about the level that he was abused in different ways that I wasn't. So people and human life is extremely complicated, and I suppose that's one issue that I have with the criminal justice system, having experienced both sides of the fence, is it tries to convince itself that it can find the answers and the truth, and in doing so, it sometimes devalues the personal experience of the person that's coming through it, and so that person gets lost. Because we're all our own experts in our own lives. It's very difficult to have some other person, regardless of how good, whether you've got a master's or a degree or how educated you are, to be able to come up with the answers about how we improve our own lives.
So tell us, where have you ended up now, Andy? Where are you heading next?
After 15 years of working in the youth justice system, I came to a conclusion that I needed to have a change. I've been very privileged. I've worked within the intensive supervision and surveillance team, which is for those leaving custody or on the way to custody. I then had 5 years working as the child looked after specialist. I've come up with projects and programs and worked with various different services to come up with alternative ways of dealing with problematic behaviour with children looked after, rather than criminalising them, to try and reduce that significant disproportionate overrepresentation. So I've done some really fantastic stuff, and of course wrote 2 books within the youth justice system. But I just felt that I was ready for a change, and so in September, on the 1st of September, I am about to embark on a new career as a university teacher with the unlocked graduates applied masters in leadership. So I'm absolutely excited, having had my experiences, to be contributing to the education of newly qualified prison officers who will be the leaders of youth justice services, probation services and prison services later on. So we know that there are some problems in the criminal justice system, and little old Andi Brierly, with his backdrop that I've just explained, gets to contribute towards making the prison system a better place, towards making it more relational, and also me developing some new skills and some new learning in the environment.